So this is just our title slide, but just want to say thank you all for joining for the AWRA Lunch and Learn series. This is our first one this year. And today we're going to be talking about water coalition building, which is really exciting. After our annual meeting in December, Wade Allred with the Southern Idaho Water Quality Coalition presented, and it came up in some of our discussions in that meeting about the variability of these types of coalition across the state and the utility of it. And it really fits in really well with the American Water Resource Association's mission, which is dedicated to the advancement of water resources management, research, and education. As many of you know, our members represent a community of water professionals with diverse backgrounds, but we share engagement in solving a range of water resources challenges. And so I have up here our website information. Remember to go there whenever you want to take a look at upcoming events. We also have a calendar on there, so you can have a Google plugin to have updates on any events that are coming up. And we have quite a few planned out for the next couple of months. We haven't set some of the dates for them yet, but we'll be announcing those soon. And today we have, I can stop sharing this. Today we are very excited to have Roy and Keri here. Roy, how do you say your last name?
Smith. No.
Oh, curious.
It's a lot easier that way. Eiguren.
Eiguren, yes, he is the founder of Eiguren Public Policy, and he has a record of solving a lot of successful public issues in regards to management, lobbying, regulatory coordination, and public policy law. He's a graduate of the Executive Management Program of the Dartmouth School of Business Administration and attended Georgetown University College of Law and the University of Idaho College Law, where he received his Juris Doctorate. Before entering the law practice in 1984, he was a special assistant to the administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration for the U.S. Department of Energy and served as the Chief of Legislative and Administrative Affairs Division of the Attorney General of the state of Idaho. He's also served as the Deputy Secretary of State and as an Ada County Deputy Prosecuting Attorney. He has coordinated large coalitions for lobbying and passage of major legislation, and testifies before many committees on his client's behalf. And he also serves on a variety of community boards as well, which is always great. Carrie York is here with the Wood River Water Collaborative. She received her bachelor's in marine biology from Jacksonville University and her master's in environmental science from Washington State University. She's worked as a fisheries biologist for NOAA and as a marine conservation biologist for the National Oceanographic Service. And she's been working in the Wood River Valley for over a decade through the Nature Conservancy, the Wood River Land Trust, Trout Unlimited, and now with the Wood River Water Collaborative. One other quick plug I wanted to make, I almost forgot about. This upcoming month, Boise State is going to be hosting software carpentry workshops, and last year it was in coordination with the DEQ conference, and this year we're going to be following up on some of the programming that we did last year with a focus on using RStudio for hydrologic analysis. And so I'm going to drop a link into the chat. We'll be sure to send this out through the listserv, but it's kind of a survey to see when folks might be available so that we can try to find an ideal time for that can fit most people's schedules that are interested in joining for that. And if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to me as well. So with that, Roy, do you want to go ahead and share your screen and you can start us off?
Sure. Can you see me okay? How's that?
Actually, I need to make you co-host so you can share your screen.
All right.
Do you have slides to share?
I do not, no.
Oh, okay. Well, then you can go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for the introduction. And let me begin the discussion from a historical standpoint. Back in the early 1990s, when I left Bonneville Power Administration and moved back home to Idaho, my boss at Bonneville Power, a gentleman by the name of Peter Johnson, who had been Bonneville Power Administrator for a 5-year period, moved to his home in McCall on Big Payette Lake. And at that point, he became concerned about water quality in Big Payette. So he asked if I could help him in finding ways to build a coalition that would be supportive of improving water quality in the lake, as well as draft legislation that would create a Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council. And so we did that in 1993. The legislature and the governor approved the legislation necessary to establish the council, and the council began its work in that same year. The council had a number of responsibilities. First and foremost was to engage appropriate scientists to do a deep dive scientific study of Big Payette Lake, a limnology study. And that was commissioned by the United States Geographic Survey, Geological Survey, and Dr. Paul Woods, who was a limnologist on the staff for USGS, conducted the study. It was done over the course of 2 years. It identified a number of issues of concern relative to the health of the lake. And so the second thing that the council had by way of responsibility under statute was to create a long-term water quality management plan that was to be adopted by the council and utilized by local, state, and federal government agencies in their regulatory and management responsibilities for Big Payette Lake. The council that was created by the act was appointed by the governor. It was an 11-person council that included representatives from Valley County, from the city of McCall, and the general public. And so that group worked long and hard in developing the water quality management plan that had many aspects to it, a significant part being best management practices associated with the various uses around the lake itself. That plan has withstood a long period of time. It still technically is in place because it was approved by the legislature upon its completion. The interesting thing, or one of the unique things about the act, was that the Big Payette Water Quality Council disbanded after a period of 10 years. The concept being that the council would have done its work, completed its work, and then assigned that or given that to the various agencies I just spoke of that would have the responsibility to implement it. Fast forward to last year, when it became apparent that there was a need to update that plan, a number of folks who had been actively involved in water quality issues on Big Payette Lake contacted me and asked if I might work with them in developing legislation that would bring back statutorily the council. By way of background, the group that was primarily responsible for that was a coalition, the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council nonprofit corporation, which was a successor, a non-governmental successor to the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council that was created by statute. That group, which has, I believe, 11 members on its board of directors, has been actively engaged in a number of issues associated with water quality on Big Payette Lake. They were the ones that approached me and asked if I would draft the legislation necessary. They also have been instrumental in developing and funding yet another study, a limnology study of Big Payette Lake. That's currently being done by the University of Idaho. Dr. Frank Wilhelm is the principal scientist involved in that work. Dr. Wilhelm is an internationally recognized limnologist and has worked literally across the globe on water quality issues and issues associated with inland lakes. The study is approximately 50% complete. 1 year's of field study was done this last summer. The second year will be done this upcoming summer, and the scientific study should be completed by sometime in the fall, and the results provided to all interested parties. Fast forward to the work that we did on legislation. In the drafting of the legislation, we worked very closely with various parties and interest who were concerned about water quality in Valley County, including very significantly the Valley County commissioners. And in my discussions with them, they felt very strongly that in addition to having a new, or I should say, updated council for Big Payette Lake, there was a need to create a new council for Lake Cascade. And so the legislation I drafted included establishing or reestablishing the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council, establishing a Lake Cascade Water Quality Council, and then assigning a number of duties to those councils, very similar to what the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Act did back in the 1990s. That legislation was introduced. It's House Bill number 117 in the Idaho House. We were moving the legislation forward when a group that's quite influential at the State House, the Idaho Water Users Association, contacted me and indicated that they had a number of concerns and questions about the legislation. And so we engaged in a dialogue with them about the concerns that they had. I would say that some of those were valid concerns from my particular point of view. And so rather than pushing forward the legislation and having a significant party and interest opposed to it, we decided that we would not move the legislation this session, but work in the interim once again in developing a statute that would be consensus legislation that would bring all the parties into it. In retrospect, I can tell you that candidly combining water quality councils for both lakes was probably an error. And the reason I say it was an error is I think all of you participating in this call understand that the two bodies of water are very, very different. One's a glacial lake, obviously Big Payette. The other is a reservoir, and the sorts of issues associated with those two bodies of water, including significant water quality issues, are very, very different. And so I think had we just proceeded with reestablishing the Big Payette Lake Water Quality Council, that would have gone through this year's legislature and have become law. But we chose again not to do that because our folks that we had working with in the Cascade area, Friends of Lake Cascade, were an integral part of our overall effort. And so we wanted to make sure that they weren't left behind, if you will, in what will be our second effort at moving this forward. Just in closing here, I can tell you from a coalition building standpoint, it was very important to involve all of the stakeholders, minus the one that we missed, and that was water users. But we involved local units of government, and so all the local cities that were associated with the two lakes were on board. The Valley County Commission was very strongly supportive. The ICL was supportive. The Wildlife Association was supportive. We had really a lot of external support. A lot of citizens who were concerned about both lakes wrote letters to the legislature. So we had a sizable coalition that was built that is still in place, and I'm optimistic will remain in place as we work on this legislation in the interim. So that's kind of my opening comments, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Roy. That's all really interesting. So we'll take, 5-10 minutes to ask Roy some questions, and then we'll hand it over to Keri. And then after we ask questions for her, we can kind of talk about both talks together. So you can either message a question in the chat or ask one directly. And I have one question just to start off, Roy. What is the main utility in putting statutory legislation around these coalitions?
Well, there's a couple reasons that I think are significant. One is the fact that the councils are appointed by the governor, kind of in the governmental hierarchy that raises a council to a higher level, if you will, than some other entity that might be associated with water quality, such as a WAG. Secondly, there was very specific statutory guidance provided to the council in the sorts of things that they were to engage in, not only the scientific study and the lake management plan, but a very significant public participation and public education program. So the essence of it is that the statutory councils elevate the overall issue of water quality to a much higher level in the governmental structure, and I think provides a lot more attention and a lot more focus on water quality in the lakes that do have the statutory council.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
The specific to the BMPs, the best management practices that that first council put in place, was there an opportunity between the time of the first council and the second to implement a lot of those, or are those, is that kind of one of the drivers for that coming back around to make sure that those were getting implemented?
And it's a little bit of both. The BMPs that were put into place were actively promoted, actively implemented in large measure, some in whole, some in part. But because of the change in circumstances and now the updated scientific study, it would be appropriate to go back and review those BMPs and make changes. And so that was one of the reasons why the folks in the coalition wanted to reestablish the council. One thing that I neglected to mention, and it was an oversight on my part, DEQ played a very significant and positive role in the development of both the council back in the 1990s and weighed in heavily in terms of the drafting of this year's legislation. In the interim between the first council and where we're at now, is DEQ implemented a number of the measures that came out of the lake management plan, the water quality management plan, including certain monitoring responsibilities and the like. So they're integral to that, and they worked with the council hand in glove.
I've got a long list of questions, so I'll keep going until other people have other ones. But I was wondering, how do these positions get filled for the appointed members on the council? I would imagine the governor is pretty busy, and that might actually be kind of a hard task.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The governor makes hundreds and hundreds of appointments, as you all know, some to very significant positions, some to perhaps less significant positions. But in the interaction that we had with the governor's office, they were ready, willing, and eager to be helpful in the identification and appointment of members to the council. What we had planned to do was, as we had done in the 1990s, the coalition that was built around the statute came up with a number of names of individuals who met the qualifications for service and who expressed an interest in serving on the council. And those names were given to the governor. And I think completely all of the names that were submitted were ultimately appointed by Governor Kempthorne. And I expect the same sort of thing would occur with Governor Little.
It's really cool to hear that it can like come from the ground up, even though it's becoming like a legislative process. And, one of the other things that you were talking about is how you brought in the Idaho Water Users Association to try to build consensus for this next version. And then that kind of created some challenges in differentiating things going on for Lake Cascade or Big Payette. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about either if you could have had an alternative perfect scenario, or maybe just speak to the utility of that consensus building?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, in my literally decades of working public policy issues at the legislature, I'll state the obvious, and that is the legislators like consensus legislation. They don't like to pick winners and losers. And so as a consequence, I've always tried to the greatest extent possible when I'm promoting legislation to have it developed as consensus legislation. So that's point number one. Point number two, in all candor, I'm much less familiar with the issues of Lake Cascade than I am Big Payette Lake. Again, my work on Big Payette Lake goes back to the 1990s. Full disclosure, I have an interest in that I own a home on Big Payette Lake. And so those several things were kind of the drivers for me to move all of this forward. It wasn't until the Valley County Commission identified Lake Cascade as an area that they wanted to have coverage by way of Water Quality Council. And so it was somewhat late in the game, mid-fall, that we began discussions with the folks at the Friends of the Cascade group. And that was when we got their input and started drafting the legislation that finally came to the legislature. The concerns that were expressed by the water users that I'd mentioned earlier were, I think, thoughtful. They were appropriate. They really dealt with primarily the issue of drawdown of the reservoir. Bureau of Rec has a variety of responsibilities legally that it must fulfill, including contractual water deliveries for irrigation districts, fish flush as required by the federal government, things of that nature. And so the folks I talked to at the Water Users Association had concerns that in some way the council might impact that. If I were to do it over again, as I mentioned, I probably would have separated the two issues and run them as two separate pieces of legislation. And that may become what we'll do this next go around, because again, given the differences between the two lakes, there probably needs to be a differentiation in the type of legislation that's developed, one for one lake, one for the other.
That's really helpful and interesting. Are there any other questions from anyone else?
I have a question, Roy. In looking at the legislation, I didn't see, maybe I didn't look close enough, but I didn't see anything related to funding. And I was just curious if that is actually part of the legislation or that will just be figured out later, because it seems like a lot of the activities, like especially water quality studies and things of that nature, are going to need significant funding. And so I was just curious about that piece of it.
Yeah, well, excellent point. The act does not address funding other than it creates an account in the state treasury where private funds that are raised can be deposited and dispensed for the purposes outlined in the act itself. To point out the historical fact that in the 1990s and early 2000 timeframe, the council was successful in raising over $80,000 in private funds to fund its various activities. And it was also able to get a grant from the federal government through USGS that funded the water quality study. The current study that I'd mentioned earlier, under the auspices of the University of Idaho and Dr. Frank Wilhelm, is being underwritten, by a combination of private funds and governmental funds. The need there is about $80,000 to complete the study. And of that amount, $25,000 has come in the form of a grant from the Valley County Commission. And the bulk of that, or the remainder of that, has been raised, or the bulk of it has been raised, such that there will be sufficient funding for the study. My take is that when you do have strong interest by citizens in the development of coalitions that support water quality, people are willing to make a contribution, particularly if a contribution can be made as a tax deductible one. And that was arranged in the University of Idaho study, in that the funding from the private sector goes to the University of Idaho Foundation, which is, I'm sure all of you know, is a private corporation that's 50c3 tax qualified by the Internal Revenue Service, which means that any contributions you make to the foundation are deductible on your federal and state income taxes. So that's the funding mechanism. I think candidly, if there was a specific statutory funding mechanism that required funding from the state, that would make the enactment of legislation considerably more difficult. And I think that begs the question in my mind as to the longer term, and that is, do we need some type of a state mechanism, statutory mechanism, that raises money for water quality issues around the state? To my knowledge, we don't have a dedicated fund to do that. And I think that's something that at an appropriate time would be very important to have the legislature and the governor undertake.
Thank you. That's great.
Roy, I have a question. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about like leading up to the initial legislation in the 90s, like who was involved with that, and was there kind of a coalition that then approached your representatives and senators to put together the legislation, or like how did that work in more detail?
An excellent question. It as I mentioned earlier, the person that was the primary catalyst for the legislation was Peter Johnson. Peter had a long time an affection and an affinity for the lake. His grandfather built the first cabin on Big Payette Lake way back in the 1920s. And so Peter had spent much of his youth in the summers on the lake. When he retired from public service, he decided not to move back to Boise, but rather move from Portland, Oregon, where Bonneville is located, to the family cabin on Big Payette Lake. And so when he returned from Bonneville, he became very concerned about the increasing population growth in the McCall and Valley County area, the increased demands, pressure on the lake. And so he began on his own motion to look at ways to address water quality from a citizen-based standpoint, and learned that there had been efforts made in other parts of the country that were led by citizens originally, and then ultimately by governments. And one of those we looked at actually was the Lake Cascade, the Lake Tahoe Compact. And so based upon all of that information, Peter began a discussion with folks in the McCall area and in the Boise area that had an interest in this particular issue, gathered them up, put together a citizens coalition that was supportive of the legislation. I drafted legislation with Peter on a pro bono basis, and the two of us, along with a lot of citizens, went to the legislature, asked for the legislation, and were able to get it. And the same thing happened here. We had a number of folks step up and write letters, send emails, contact legislators, urging that they adopt the legislation. Sometimes it takes one person who is very passionate and very motivated to put together or to be the catalyst, if you will, the seminal point for a coalition to be built.
That's a really good point. And I mean, one person and perhaps some other folks that are willing to help, like you have already, it sounds like, in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. We'll switch it over to Carrie, and then we can continue on questions at the end as well. Carrie, do you have slides that you want to share?
Yeah, I did put together some slides just because But I guess I'll start off with saying that our collaborative is a little different than the one that Roy talked about. And one of the reasons I was asking about the legislation is that, you know, currently our collaborative is, I mean, I consider it voluntary. Like, you know, some of us get paid to coordinate and attend, but a lot of it is just strictly voluntary from the water users. And one thing that we have talked about at various points is whether or not our collaborative could and should become something more formal. And one of the alternatives that we've talked about is seeing about proposing or having one of our senators or representatives propose legislation. And so it was interesting to hear, you know, that that's how your collaborative has been successful for that long of a period of time. And there's other collaboratives in the state that we know of that were formed by legislation and that have, you know, other benefits. So anyways, I'll just start off saying that is that it's ours is, you know, kind of primarily run or organized by the Wood River Land Trust, who I work for, the Nature Conservancy, Idaho Conservation League has been involved, and Trout Unlimited. And so ours is more kind of coordinated by the nonprofits, but it does consist of about 65 different water users throughout our basin. Not everyone participates all the time. Generally our meetings, we have like 20 to 30 people, but there's 65 people on the email list. So I will, I guess, share my screen. We can do that. Okay, sometimes my screen takes a minute. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah. Oh. Now. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it takes a little bit to get up there. So I'm just going to leave it in this mode, I think. So our collaborative is in the Big Wood River Basin, which is kind of over in South Central Idaho, and it's comprised of the Big Wood River, Little Wood River, and Camas Creek watersheds. So this is kind of a map of where our kind of service area is. And we started kind of working within this collaborative nature kind of somewhere around 2014, 2015, 2016. We don't have like an actual start date because of how things evolved through different conversations and meetings. But in that time period, our basin had gone through adjudication with the state. And through that, there was a groundwater measurement district that was created. Folks, mostly irrigators, had to start implementing water measuring devices to help within that measurement district. And then we had several years of drought. And then subsequently some kind of heavier snowpack and water years, more in like 2017, 2018. In that same time period, the state started administering conjunctive management between our ground and surface water resources because that hadn't previously been administered that way. They're still kind of working out how that actually works. And at the same time, the USGS and Department of Water Resources was developing a groundwater flow model for the Big Wood River Basin. So all this stuff kind of started happening. And as nonprofits that are interested in our water resources and in protecting fish and wildlife habitat, agriculture, and our drinking water supplies, we wanted to be involved in the conversation. So in other basins, when water rights are being handled at the state level or through water calls or things like that, conservation groups are often not at the table because sometimes we own water rights, but in most cases, they're small in comparison to agricultural water rights. And so we really wanted to be a part of the conversation and have a seat at the table. And So that was one of the reasons why we started getting involved initially. So I like to show this picture because this is like our first kind of take at what our basin, what our irrigation looks like and what our water collaborative looks like. And this was drawn by our surface water water master. And the reason I like it is because, you know, it really took a lot of thought in thinking about how water flows through our basin. Like, we all think that we know how it works, but just in the years that I've been working on this, like, I've learned so much. And one of the things that that's just kind of one of the attributes of our basin is that we have one storage reservoir, but it doesn't feed the entire basin. It's actually lower down in the system. And so a lot of the water that goes to irrigate the surface water on agricultural fields actually needs to come through our rivers and our streams. So in a lot of cases, some of the things that we wanted to see throughout the water collaborative are aligned with some of the agricultural practices and irrigation practices, which is unique because in other basins where you have your reservoir and your storage mechanisms up high, that's not always the case. So there have been 2 water calls that have been filed. They've both been dismissed because of technical issues. But what was happening, or it's kind of currently still the situation, is that so this is kind of a map of our surface or our water delivery blocks, and most of the senior surface water rights are down in the south. And so they started calling on groundwater users in the upper part of the basin, and that's what the water calls have been filed on. And what we have tried to provide within our collaborative is a space for water users to come together and try to form solutions outside of litigation, because in other basins, litigation has been the primary strategy for resolving these water conflicts. And maybe we were a little hopeful in thinking that our collaborative could provide a space for that. But that's one of the things that we wanted to do. And I feel like we've been somewhat successful in that. Here's a picture of our collaborative. So, you know, people will come to the table and talk about issues, but through the years, we've seen that there still needs to be additional structure or direction from either IDWR or the courts to really get to a point of resolution. So let's see. So some of our goals have been to broaden stakeholder participation, make sure that we're including water users throughout the entirety of those basins. Some of our initial kind of actions were to calculate water needs. We needed to form groundwater districts because they didn't exist. So all the groundwater users didn't have a way of having a collective voice. We wanted to secure funding for projects, provide resources for members, and then, like I said, have some involvement in settlement agreements, and at some point come up with a water transaction exchange framework. So we were able to implement a few projects, and then in 2019, we were awarded a Bureau of Reclamation Cooperative Watershed Management Program Phase 1 grant, which was awesome because what that enables us to do is it provides some funding for us as staff to coordinate and administer the water collaborative. And then it also provides funding for project planning activities. And what that's really enabled us to do is, in addition to providing the collaborative and the space for people to come together and try to resolve issues, we can actually take on some projects that can provide resources for the collaborative. And so one of those has actually involved Kendra. So Kendra's been working on a surface flow prediction modeling tool for us. And that will determine surface flows on February 1st, March 1st, and April 1st at 4 different stream flow gauge locations. And then we also wanted to have curtailment dates for different priority water rights within the basin. And the purpose of doing this is so that we're better able to predict what our annual surface flows might be from annual snowpack levels, and then be able to make better decisions on water management, crop planting, and implementation of different water conservation strategies, such as recharge and things like that. So that's been the first project that we've been able to implement with that cooperative watershed management program grant funding. We're also looking at some other activities. We're hoping to refine some of Kendra's modeling tools, look at work related to water transactions, because that's something that we want to implement at some point in the future. Look at irrigation efficiencies, and then there's been a recent proposal to evaluate how groundwater levels are associated with surface flows. So that's kind of a brief picture of where we've come and where we're at. Some of the things that we are continuing to address, like I talked about earlier, were, what in the long-term outcome, like what's the purpose and the structure of the water collaborative? Do we continue to exist as a collaborative? Do we look at a more formal framework? We have some tools that are available to us, but one of the things that we'd like to see is some way to shepherd water in stream, like they have mechanisms to do so in the Upper Salmon. We're also considering looking at phase 2 grants for implementing some of the projects that we are doing some planning for in the phase 1, and then again thinking about water transactions. So it's definitely been a work in progress. It's it's one of those projects that I really think is valuable to resolving our water quantity issues, but it's a continual challenge to meet the needs of everyone involved in the group. So, I'm happy that we've been able to be a part of it and provide some resources to the group. And so I think, we'll continue to exist for at least a little while longer. But anyways, that's what I have to share.
Thanks, Carrie. That was great. Anyone have any questions for Carrie?
I've got one for you, Carrie. So the water exchange mechanism or those transactions, is that, are you looking at kind of a broad portfolio in terms of like aquifer recharge and also kind of those shorter term transactions of water banking and that kind of thing? Or has the coalition gotten very far into that, or?
No, is the short answer. So one of the kind of challenges is while there's been these water calls and there hasn't been a management plan or a mitigation plan put into place, people are really hesitant to do anything related to transactions. The Nature Conservancy, they were able to do a 1-year transaction with a landowner where they essentially, paid them not to irrigate for a portion of the year. And they're pursuing another transaction that would essentially, it's kind of grouped with a conservation easement, but it would take a certain percentage of all of the water on one farm and dedicate that to activities within a resolved management plan or mitigation plan, such as recharge. But certain members in our collaborative have worked in other basins, like in the Upper Salmon or over in Eastern Idaho, and have done different water transactions. And so we've, eventually we want to get there, and we feel like we have the tools and the resources to do those things. I think it's just going to take a little bit more time before people are going to be comfortable entering into those types of agreements.
And kind of setting up a little bit more of that structure to
yeah,
provide them that security. Okay.
Mhm.
Cool, thank you.
I was wondering, was there a specific event or person that was kind of a catalyst for initiating this, kind of like how Roy had been talking about for their group?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a few people. So Mark Davidson, who worked at the Nature Conservancy for a long time, he was kind of a primary person in the beginning. Our surface water master, he was a really key person in the beginning as well, which has been really helpful because he's trusted by a lot of people in the basin. And so having him be a part of those very initial conversations, I think really bought us a lot of goodwill for people to start kind of becoming part of the group. Peter Anderson, who used to work for Trout Unlimited, you know, he's an attorney, and having his expertise in some of the legal frameworks and kind of thinking about water transactions has also been really helpful. So yeah, I'd say it's kind of like a mixture of those folks.
It's interesting that you mentioned Peter, because it sounds like in both cases there has been somebody that has interests in a given basin that has expertise on the law side. And I wonder if that's like maybe a critical component. I'd be curious to hear from other coalitions if they've also had a similar individuals contribute. Roy, do you know of other collaboratives that have structures similar to either of these, that have like other attorneys that you know, or lawyers that work on these things in the state?
You know, I'm familiar with one, and that is the Lake Pend Oreille Commission. An attorney by the name Ford Alsasser was very actively involved in the development of that, and that commission really is very similar to what we were proposing for the two lakes in Valley County.
Yeah, and I think too for us, like Peter has a lot of experience with water resources. He used to be a hearing officer, and so just having someone that knows a lot about water rights has been really helpful. Yeah.
Well, Casa, Pat Wickman asking a question kind of for Roy at the same time. You know, I've gone through of Kerry's presentation. Do you feel this is something worth pursuing a statutory coalition? And how do my volume went out?
Oh. Yeah, I guess so, Pat. When we brought this up at our collaborative meetings, it's so funny. I feel like people kind of like it the way it is, and so we didn't really feel a lot of support for pursuing that at this time. There's also been this other group formed by Water Resources. They're a advisory committee to our groundwater management area, and they've kind of been charged with seeing if they can figure out a resolution to the water call. So I think until some of those actions, or we see where that group is headed and what the outcomes of it are, people are going to be hesitant to kind of go forward with any legislation or anything like that. But, you know, it's possible we could go that route.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and I'll just say too, so I forgot to mention, we do have our local senators and representatives have been part of the water collaborative, which has actually been really helpful because they've been able to kind of think about some of these issues and take them, you know, as they go to work on various things at the State House. Our county commissioners have also been involved. Like, we've really tried to broaden our involvement. And yeah, I think if legislation is something we wanted to pursue, the folks that have been participating, you know, having them participate for a number of years will probably be helpful to us if we decide to go that route.
Kendra, I have a question for both Keri and Roy. Just listening to the presentations, and Roy, I have to apologize, I missed the early part of your presentation, but it seems like these groups usually start with some focus. Keri, in your instance, it was water supply. Other groups are water quality, have more of a water quality focus. But it seems to me that, as our understanding of the interconnectedness between water quality and water supply, as our understanding of that improves, these groups give us a forum for, brokering, either brokering the deal. I call it brokering the deals, or finding the compromises that identify multi-benefit projects that span multiple interests within a watershed. Can both of you talk to, I guess that looking forward, how your groups would are positioned to take on multiple challenges in the watershed?
Well, I think as it relates to the work that we're going to do in the interim between now and the next legislative session, we'll be very collaborative and identify folks that have not been a part of our effort to date, again, with the goal of having consensus legislation. I think that the group that I've been working with it would welcome additional challenges. What I've learned in this process is that there really, in many cases, at least in this case, there are not forums where all the parties can come together and go through both quality as well as quantity issues. And so that's, I think, one of the benefits of having a statutory council that has a responsibility to deal with both issues.
Yeah, and for us, we've talked about trying to more incorporate water quantity. We do have some projects that have incorporated best management practices and things like that. But to date, we've mostly relied on our WAG to really tackle the water quality issue. But there have been some conversations about making the water collaborative bigger and incorporating restoration, water quality, like all these other things. And for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't handle that. So like if, but not to say that if there was legislation that, appointed a council and there was funding for, a bigger, broader group like that, I think there would be support for it.
Sure. So if I understand the question, or if I understand your response to the question, taking on, a broader scope, is exciting, especially because the problems are interconnected. However, doing that also makes the group less nimble, right? There's there are more stakeholders to be involved in. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and it involves a lot more work.
Right.
Yeah.
And then real quick, I guess maybe a plug or something to consider that map that the Surface Water Master drew up. Those, I've seen so many of those at the beginnings of projects to try and get people on the same page and eliminate the black box of what our inputs and outputs are from a watershed. And I've used, and I know a lot of people have used, a Google Earth file that Hawk Stone put together for the Treasure Valley that has all the canals and laterals and drains identified on that. And if that could make its way into a digital format that people could access, that would be awesome.
Yeah, we've done some work on that. Like I have a layer of most of the canals. So yeah, but I definitely think providing that transparency and having those visuals has been really helpful, especially to people that aren't the water master driving around, who know where all the ditches and things like that are. And so we've done a couple of tours as well. Actually, one was for Kendra, for her to get a better understanding of the basin. And gosh, it was just so great to have folks out there and like be at a certain point and be like, oh, this is what this diversion looks like. And east goes this way. And, you know, so I think, yeah, maybe we should think about having more of those just to get everyone on the same page. So yeah, that's a good idea.
Cool.
Yeah, and having those, being able to actually look at things is so valuable. You know, same thing in the Treasure Valley, going out and looking around the Pioneer Irrigation District and talking to the water masters and the irrigators themselves makes a huge difference for just getting an idea, at least conceptually, of how things work. And you know, that's one thing that AWRA can also facilitate our fun outings like that. Our last outing was pre-COVID when we went out to the Dixie Drain and looked at their facility out there. And maybe we can, the team can think about where we might want to go this summer to facilitate more of that, because it's a great experience. So we're up on the hour and I don't want to hold anybody over, but thank you all for coming and for great questions. And thank you, Roy and Keri, again for presenting. It was great hearing from both of you. And if AWRA can help at all in facilitating any of these kind of forums, it would be really great to find other ways that we can help as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. It was great to be a part of this.
Yeah, likewise.
Have a nice afternoon.